Did you know that the quietest moments in history are often the most defining? Imagine the world holding its breath, the air thick with dust and memory, after the loudest, most destructive crescendo of violence humanity has ever orchestrated. It's a silence that isn't peaceful, but heavy, like a blanket woven from ash and exhaustion. It's the kind of quiet you might find after the most chaotic party imaginable, where everyone now just stands and stares at the unbelievable mess, wondering where to even begin cleaning up. Just before we dive in, please take a second to tap the like button and subscribe to the channel. It's the single best way to support our work and ensure you never miss a new story. We're always curious, so let us know in the comments what part of the world you're in and what time it is for you. Now, find yourself a comfortable position and let your mind drift back to that singular moment in the spring of 1945. You were standing in what was once a city. It could be Dresden, or Warsaw, or Berlin. The name doesn't matter, because the scene is hauntingly the same across a continent. The sky is a flat, indifferent grey. Skeletal remains of buildings claw at this sky, their empty window sockets like the eyes of skulls. The air carries a unique scent, a cocktail of damp plaster, cold ash, and the faint, metallic temps of ruin. Under your feet, the ground isn't solid. It's a shifting landscape of rubble, a graveyard of bricks and twisted steel where streets used to be. The most profound feature of this landscape is the silence. For 6 long years, this air was torn apart by the scream of sirens, the roar of engines, the percussive thunder of bombs, and the crackle of fire. Now, those noises are gone, and what remains is an emptiness so profound it feels like a physical presence. It presses in on you, a silence born not of peace, but of absence. An absence of traffic, of commerce, of music, of laughter. Through this ghostly tableau, people are beginning to move. They don't walk with purpose, but drift, their movements slow and weary. Their faces are canvases of conflicting emotions, the stark relief of survival painted over a deeper, more permanent layer of loss and trauma. The war is over, they tell themselves, but the word peace feels alien, a concept from a forgotten language. This is not just the end of a war, you realize, it is the end of an entire world. The old European empires that had dominated the globe for centuries are now either shattered or bankrupt, their grand capitals turned to dust. The scale of the loss is staggering, a number that the human mind struggles to grasp. Over 60 million souls, gone. And for those who remain, the world has been fundamentally broken. In the ruins of German cities, you see the first signs of a strange, desperate new beginning. Groups of women, who had come to be known as the Trümmerfrauen, or rubble women, are already at work. With little more than buckets in their bare hands, they begin the impossible task of clearing the debris, of salvaging one unbroken brick at a time, trying to build a future out of the literal fragments of their past. This vast, silent, wounded continent is a vacuum, a void of power and direction, and you can almost feel the laws of political physics at work. A vacuum this large cannot remain empty for long. Into this vacuum, 2 new powers begin to assert themselves, drawn toward the center of the void like magnets. You watch them, the United States and the Soviet Union, and you see that for the last few years they have been fighting on the same side. You can picture that iconic moment from just weeks ago, the meeting at the Elbe River. Young American GIS and weathered Soviet soldiers, grinning from ear to ear, embracing on a broken bridge. They share cigarettes, swig from flasks of questionable spirits, and slap each other on the back, united in a moment of pure, unadulterated victory. For a brief, shining instant, it seems like this shared triumph could forge a lasting friendship. But as you look closer at their uniforms, at the flags on their sleeves, you see more than just different armies. You see 2 entirely different worlds. This alliance was never a marriage of love. It was a partnership of desperation, a classic case of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. On one side, you have the United States, a nation built on the ideals of individual liberty, capitalism, and democratic choice. It sees the world as a marketplace of ideas and goods, where the best will naturally rise to the top. Its vision for the post-war world is one of open doors, free trade, and self-determination, an image it champions with genuine belief, even if its own history has complicated exceptions. On the other side is the Soviet Union, a revolutionary state forged in fire and ideology. It is built on the teachings of Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin, a belief in the power of the collective over the individual, and the absolute necessity of state control to achieve a classless, communist utopia. It views capitalism not as a system of opportunity, but as a machine of exploitation and oppression. For the duration of the war, this fundamental clash was conveniently ignored. In fact, you would have seen a surprising amount of effort in the West to paint their communist allies in a heroic light. American wartime propaganda portrayed Joseph Stalin not as a ruthless dictator, which he was, but as the firm, dependable Uncle Joe, a man of the people leading his nation in a heroic struggle. Hollywood produced films celebrating the bravery of the Red Army, conveniently leaving out the parts about the secret police and the gulags. It was an awkward, temporary truce between two systems that fundamentally believed the other shouldn't exist. Now, with their common enemy defeated, the one great reason for their cooperation has been reduced to ashes in a bunker in Berlin. The silence that has fallen over Europe is the sound of that single, unifying purpose evaporating into the ether. Historians still argue about what happened next. Some believe the clash was inevitable, a conflict that had been simmering since the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. Others wonder if, with different leaders or different choices, this fragile partnership could have been preserved. But as you stand in the rubble, you can feel the ideological temperature dropping. The warmth of the Elbe River handshake is fading fast, replaced by a creeping, suspicious chill. The two victors now stand facing each other over the corpse of their mutual foe, finally forced to confront the irreconcilable differences that lie at the very core of their existence. At the heart of this great ideological divide are not just systems, but men. You see them now, the three architects of this new, fractured world, their personalities and pasts shaping every decision that will follow. First, you look to Washington, where a man who never expected to be here now sits in the most powerful chair on earth. Harry S. Truman is not Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He lacks the aristocratic charm and the long, seasoned experience. He is a former haberdasher from Missouri, a plain-spoken nonsense man who was thrust into the presidency by Roosevelt's sudden death. He has a sign on his desk that famously reads, "The buck stops here," and he takes it to heart. Truman is deeply, almost instinctively, suspicious of the Soviet system, where Roosevelt may have harbored a hope that he could charm and reason with Stalin. Truman sees only a looming threat to the liberty he holds dear. He is not an ideologue in the grand sense, but a pragmatist who views Soviet actions in Eastern Europe not as a search for security, but as a series of broken promises and a creeping, aggressive expansion that must be stopped. Then, you turn your gaze to Moscow, to the Kremlin, where Joseph Stalin resides. His adopted name means man of steel, and it is a terrifyingly accurate description. The warm Uncle Joe of Western propaganda is a carefully constructed fantasy. The real Stalin is a creature of immense cunning, deep paranoia, and absolute ruthlessness. His worldview has been forged by a lifetime of conspiracy, revolution, and brutal purges of his own people. He is also a student of Russian history, a history defined by repeated, devastating invasions from the West, from Napoleon to Hitler. So when he looks at the map of Europe, he doesn't see nations to be liberated. He sees a necessary buffer, a sphere of influence that will protect the Soviet motherland from the next inevitable attack. He views Western calls for free elections in Poland or Romania as profound hypocrisy, a cynical attempt to install hostile anti-Soviet governments right on his doorstep. In his mind, the Red Army paid in blood for that territory, and he has no intention of giving it up. Funnily enough, for a man so dedicated to opposing the American way of life, One of his private passions was watching American cowboy movies, admiring their clear lines between good and evil. Finally, you see the third man, Winston Churchill, standing in London. He is the old lion, the man whose defiant voice held the free world together during its darkest hour. More than anyone, he understands the true nature of Stalin's ambition. He had been warning about the dangers of Bolshevism for decades. He sees with perfect, painful clarity the shadow that is falling across the continent. But Churchill represents a fading power. Great Britain is victorious, but exhausted and bankrupt. The war has passed the torch of global leadership, from London to Washington and Moscow. At the conference tables in places like Yalta and Potsdam, Churchill argues and warns, trying to make the Americans see the wily workings of the Soviet mind. But he is increasingly a junior partner. Historians still debate the Yalta Conference, questioning whether Roosevelt was naive and gave away Eastern Europe, or whether he was simply a realist who understood that he couldn't force the Red Army out of lands it had already conquered. What is certain is that the post-war world is now being shaped by the collision of these three psyches: Truman's rigid sense of democratic morality, Stalin's deep-seated, paranoid security obsessions, and Churchill's weary, prophetic wisdom. Now you see the Allies turning their attention to the very heart of the problem. Germany itself. The country lies prostrate, a nation not just defeated, but utterly dismantled. There is no German government to negotiate with, no leader to sign a treaty. The entire state has ceased to exist, leaving only a population of millions adrift in a sea of ruin. The question looming over the victors is monumental. What do you do with a nation that unleashed such catastrophe upon the world? The desire for vengeance is a powerful, palpable thing. Some in the Allied camp, most notably U.S. Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau Jr., advocated for a plan of radical deindustrialization. His infamous Morgenthau Plan proposed stripping Germany of all its heavy industry and converting it into a pre-modern, pastoral landscape of farms and fields. The idea was to permanently neuter German power, ensuring it could never again build a war machine. For a time, this extreme vision was seriously considered, a testament to the depth of anger and fear Germany had inspired. Ultimately, a more pragmatic, if no less complicated, solution was chosen. You can almost see the scene at the conference table, the leaders leaning over a massive map of Germany, drawing lines with fat, colored pencils. They agreed to carve the nation into 4 distinct zones of occupation. The British take the northwest, an industrial and coastal region. The Americans take the south, a more rural and scenic area that included Bavaria. The French, after some initial debate, are granted a zone in the southwest, and the Soviets, whose armies had bled the most to get there, are given the largest piece, the eastern third of the country. This division, they all agreed, was to be a temporary measure, a way to manage the immediate chaos, oversee denazification, and guide Germany back toward some form of stable, peaceful existence. It was an administrative solution, not a permanent political dissection. But inside this already complicated puzzle lies another, far more volatile one. The capital city, Berlin. You can trace its location on the map with your finger, and you notice the immediate, glaring problem. Berlin is located deep inside the Soviet zone of occupation, more than 100 miles from the nearest Western-controlled territory. Despite this, the capital is considered too important to be left to a single power. So, in a decision that would define the next half-century, the city of Berlin is itself divided, a perfect miniature of the larger national partition. It too is carved into 4 sectors, one for each of the Allied powers. You now have a geographic and political absurdity, an island of American, British, and French administration floating in the middle of a vast, Soviet-controlled sea. You can picture the bizarre reality on the ground. A single street could be patrolled by American MPs on one side and Soviet soldiers on the other. A subway line might pass from the British sector through the Soviet sector and back into the French sector on a single journey. Historians look back at this decision with a mix of awe and dread. Was it a necessary compromise to keep the peace, or a foolishly optimistic arrangement that was doomed from the start? As you watch the different flags go up over different districts of the shattered city, you sense that this temporary solution is pouring a foundation of concrete. The lines drawn on these maps are starting to seep into the very soil, creating a wound that would not heal. A place where the simmering distrust between East and West would soon erupt into a full-blown fever. As the Allied powers focus on the intricate problem of Germany, you feel your perspective pull back, like a camera ascending high into the air. From this vantage point, you look east, beyond the borders of the occupation zones, and you see the vast territories where the Soviet Red Army is not just a guest administrator, but the sole dominant military force. You are looking at Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, nations with their own rich histories, languages, and cultures. These were the lands that suffered first and longest under the Nazi jackboot, and for them, the arrival of the Red Army was a moment of genuine liberation. You can imagine the scenes in Warsaw or Prague, the weary, tearful cheers as the tanks rolled in, a brutal occupation finally ending. A flicker of hope for a free future was kindled in the hearts of millions. But now, as the months of 1945 turn into 1946, you notice a subtle, disquieting change. The liberation is beginning to feel like a new kind of occupation. The process is not a sudden violent takeover. It is something far more methodical and insidious. A technique that a Hungarian communist leader would later famously describe as salami tactics. You watch as the Soviets, and the local communist parties they sponsor, begin to slice away at the foundations of democracy, one thin piece at a time. First, they insist on the formation of coalition governments, which on the surface looks fair and inclusive. They invite socialists, agrarians, and liberals to join, creating a facade of national unity. But the key ministries, the ones that hold the real power, always seem to end up in communist hands. The Ministry of the Interior, which controls the police and the security services, is the most crucial slice. Once they control the police, the next slice comes off. Non-communist political leaders are suddenly accused of being fascist collaborators or enemies of the state. They are arrested, their newspapers are shut down, their parties are outlawed. The free press is slowly squeezed until only the state-approved voice remains. Then comes the slice of rigged elections, where the results are known long before the votes are counted. Finally, with all opposition eliminated, the coalition is dissolved, and a single-party state is declared, firmly aligned with Moscow. You watch this process repeat itself across Eastern Europe with chilling efficiency. It's like watching a tide come in, not with a crashing wave, but with a slow, silent, inexorable creep that covers everything. Historians continue to debate whether this was Stalin's grand design from the very beginning, or a defensive reaction to what he perceived as Western hostility. Was he a communist crusader bent on expansion, or a paranoid Russian nationalist obsessed with creating a buffer zone of friendly states to protect his borders? From your vantage point, the distinction feels almost academic. The result is the same. A vast swath of Central and Eastern Europe is disappearing behind a veil of silence and control. The hopeful promises made at Yalta about free and unfettered elections now ring hollow, echoing in the quiet, fearful streets of these newly captured capitals. They are becoming satellite states, their national sovereignty lost as they are pulled into the powerful gravitational orbit of the Soviet Union. The salami tactics are quiet, methodical, and largely invisible to the wider world, unfolding behind a veil of confusing headlines and dense diplomatic cables. For this creeping reality to become a global confrontation, it needs a voice. It needs someone with the authority and the eloquence to give it a name. You find this voice not in the halls of power, but in a position of unexpected exile. Winston Churchill, the man who personified British defiance, has suffered a stunning political defeat. Just after winning the war, the British people voted him out of office, eager for a change and a focus on domestic rebuilding. So now, in March of 1946, he is a private citizen. Yet, his voice still carries immense weight, and he has accepted an invitation to speak at a small, unassuming institution, Westminster College, in the quiet town of Fulton, Missouri. You can picture the scene. It's a classic slice of small-town America. President Truman, a Missouri native himself, accompanies Churchill on the train, lending the event his presidential seal of approval. The atmosphere in the college gymnasium is warm, perhaps a little stuffy. The crowd is expecting to be charmed by the legendary wartime leader, to hear a speech full of victory, hope, and Anglo-American friendship, and for a while, that's what they get. Churchill, a master orator, begins with warmth and humor, praising the special relationship between the United States and the British Commonwealth. But then, you feel a shift in the air. The familiar, rumbling cadence of his voice takes on a harder, more serious edge. The folksy charm recedes, replaced by the grim tone of a prophet delivering an unwelcome but necessary warning. He is about to say what everyone in the corridors of power knows but is afraid to say out loud. He paints a picture of the world as it now stands, praising the United States at the pinnacle of its power. Then, he turns his gaze to the continent he just helped liberate, and he delivers the phrase that will echo through history. From Stettin in the Baltic, he growls, to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. The words hang in the air of that Missouri gymnasium. Iron curtain. It is a brilliant, terrifying, and instantly understandable metaphor. It's not a wall of stone or a line of soldiers. It's a barrier of secrecy, of censorship, of absolute control. Behind that curtain, he lists the famous old capitals of Europe: Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest, and Sofia. All are now subject to Soviet influence and an increasing measure of control from Moscow. He speaks of police states and the suppression of liberty. He is pulling back the veil, exposing the salami tactics for the entire world to see. The reaction is immediate and explosive. In the West, many are shocked by his bluntness, with some critics accusing him of being a warmonger, needlessly provoking the Soviets. In Moscow, the response is pure fury. Stalin himself gives a rare interview to the state newspaper Pravda, comparing Churchill to Hitler and accusing him of trying to instigate a new war. The speech, officially titled "The Sinews of Peace," becomes universally known by its most famous phrase. Historians still debate its impact. Did Churchill's words simply give a name to an already existing reality? Or did his powerful rhetoric actually help to create the Cold War by poisoning the atmosphere and making compromise impossible? Whatever the truth, the effect was undeniable. The division of Europe was no longer a quiet, creeping process. It was now a public declaration, a line drawn not on a map, but in the minds of millions. The shadow now had a name. Churchill's speech has hung a name on the growing fear, but a name alone doesn't create a policy. The Iron Curtain is a powerful metaphor, but for the men in Washington, it remains an abstraction. They need a specific place, a specific crisis, where this shadowy threat becomes a tangible reality. They do not have to wait long. The crisis arrives in the form of a diplomatic note, delivered on a cold winter day in February of 1947. It comes from London, the old heart of global power, and its message marks the end of an era. You can almost feel the historical weight of that piece of paper as it lands on the desk of the American Secretary of State. The British government, the great empire on which the sun never set, is officially broke. For centuries, Britain had been the world's policeman, its navy patrolling the seas and its influence propping up friendly regimes. Now, exhausted by 2 world wars, it can no longer afford the role. The note is very specific. Great Britain announces it is ending its financial and military aid to 2 crucial countries on the edge of the Soviet sphere, Greece and Turkey. This news sends a jolt of pure panic through the American government. You look at the map with them and see exactly why. Greece is in the midst of a bitter and bloody civil war. The fragile, pro-Western royalist government is fighting a losing battle against communist-led insurgents who are receiving aid from neighboring communist states like Yugoslavia. If Greece falls, it would be the first armed overthrow of a non-communist government since the war ended. Then there is Turkey, the guardian of the vital straits, connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. Stalin is exerting immense pressure on the Turks, demanding joint control of these waterways. This was a centuries-old Russian ambition, a quest for a warm water port, and it would give the Soviet Navy free rein in the Mediterranean, threatening the entire Middle East and its vast oil reserves. President Truman sees the situation with stark clarity. This is the first test. The dominoes are lined up. If Greece falls, Turkey will be next to capitulate. If Turkey falls, the Soviet shadow will stretch across the Middle East, and potentially Western Europe would be intimidated into submission. The British have passed the torch, or perhaps they simply dropped it, and America is the only nation with the strength to pick it up. On March 12, 1947, Truman stands before a joint session of Congress. He knows he needs to do more than just ask for aid for two small countries. He needs to rally the nation for a new kind of global struggle. In his plain, unadorned speaking style, he lays out a revolutionary new principle for American foreign policy. He declares that the world is now divided between two ways of life, one based on the will of the majority and individual freedom, the other based on the will of a minority forcibly imposed upon the majority. He proclaims that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. This statement becomes known as the Truman Doctrine. It is a formal declaration of Cold War. Historians still argue about it. Some say Truman masterfully used the crisis to awaken an isolationist America to its new global responsibilities. Others claim he exaggerated the Soviet threat in Greece and Turkey to justify a massive, militarized foreign policy. Whatever the case, Congress approves $400 million in aid, and the line is drawn. This is the policy of containment in action. America will not try to roll back communism where it already exists, but it will meet any attempt to expand its influence with firm resistance. The political and military line in the sand has been drawn, but a new realization is dawning on Washington. You can't just fight an idea with guns, you have to fight it with a better idea. With the Truman Doctrine, you have drawn a military line in the sand. But now you look across Western Europe and you see that the greatest threat isn't a Soviet tank army rolling across the plains. The greatest threat is internal. It is cold, hunger, and despair. The winter of 1946-1947 was one of the harshest in living memory. The continent is still a wreck. Economies are shattered, factories are idle, and people are starving. In France and Italy, the local communist parties are immensely popular, capitalizing on the misery. They are winning elections, organizing strikes, and telling the desperate populace that the capitalist system has failed them, that only communism offers a path forward. To the pragmatic minds in Washington, it becomes clear that containment cannot just be a military strategy, it must also be an economic one. You can't stop communism if the very people you're trying to protect are so poor and hungry, they are willing to vote it into power. The architect of this new strategy is a man who seems the very opposite of a charismatic leader. General George C. Marshall is the U.S. Secretary of State. He is a quiet, reserved, deeply respected figure, the man who was the organizational genius behind the American military victory in World War II. He is not a politician, but a soldier and a statesman. In June of 1947, he chooses an unlikely venue to launch his world-changing idea, a commencement address at Harvard University. There are no television cameras, no grand fanfare. He speaks in his typical dry, understated manner, laying out not a detailed plan, but a simple, profound offer. He states that if the nations of Europe can come together and devise a rational, cooperative plan for their own recovery, then the United States will provide the financial support to make it happen. You see the genius of his proposal. It's not a handout, it's a partnership. America isn't just going to dump money on individual countries. The Europeans must work together, breaking down old national rivalries and trade barriers that had plagued them for centuries. They have to decide for themselves how to best use the aid, creating a unified plan. This forces cooperation between old enemies like France and Germany, laying the groundwork for what would eventually become the European Union. And here is the truly audacious part. The offer is technically open to everyone in Europe, including the Soviet Union and its new satellite states in the East. Marshall and his colleagues suspect the Soviets will refuse, but by making the offer universal, they seize the moral high ground. They are not creating a divided Europe. They are saying, we are offering to rebuild the entire continent, and if anyone chooses to stay out, that is their decision. The program, officially the European Recovery Program, quickly becomes known to the world as the Marshall Plan. It is an act of breathtaking generosity, but also one of shrewd self-interest. The American economy needs a rebuilt Europe to buy its goods, and American security needs a prosperous and stable Europe as a bulwark against communism. The scale of the aid is astronomical. Over the next 4 years, the United States will pour more than $13 billion, the equivalent of over $150 billion today, into rebuilding Western Europe. Historians almost universally praise the Marshall Plan as one of the most successful foreign policy initiatives in history. It helped fuel the Wirtschaftswunder, the German economic miracle, and similar recoveries across the continent. It stabilized shaky governments, undercut the appeal of communism, and bound Western Europe tightly to the United States. It was the other half of containment, the golden lifeline, a promise that a future of freedom also meant a future of prosperity. The economic battle for Europe's soul had begun. The golden lifeline of the Marshall Plan is now stretched out across the Atlantic, a shimmering promise of prosperity. You can almost see it as a physical thing, a bridge of ships laden with food, steel, and machinery, ready to rebuild a broken continent. And as George Marshall intended, this offer is extended without prejudice. The lifeline reaches toward the capitals behind the Iron Curtain, to Warsaw, to Prague, and even to Moscow itself. For a brief, tantalizing moment, it seems the offer might be accepted. The initial Soviet reaction is not one of instant rejection. It is one of intense curiosity and internal debate. The USSR is in ruins, having suffered more devastation than any other nation. The prospect of American aid to rebuild their shattered cities and factories is incredibly tempting. You can picture the scene in Paris, in the summer of 1947, where European leaders gather to discuss the American proposal. A massive Soviet delegation arrives, led by the stern and unyielding foreign minister, Vyacheslav Molotov. His nickname in diplomatic circles was Mr. Nyet, or Mr. No, for his stone-faced intransigence. But his very presence in Paris, with a team of nearly 100 experts, suggests that this time, the answer might be different. The discussions begin, but a critical point of friction emerges almost immediately. The Americans insist that the recovery program must be cooperative and transparent. Countries receiving aid would have to open their economic books, revealing their resources and their deficits, so a coordinated plan could be made. For the nations of Western Europe, this is a reasonable, if challenging, condition. For the Soviet Union, it is an absolute impossibility. You see the offer through Stalin's paranoid eyes. This isn't generosity, it's espionage. It's a Trojan horse, a brilliant American trick to use dollar diplomacy to infiltrate the economies of Eastern Europe, to allow American auditors and planners to scrutinize the inner workings of the Soviet state would be to give away state secrets and surrender economic control. It would be like asking a bank for a loan, and the bank demanding full access to your personal diary, your private thoughts, and the keys to your house. Stalin sees the Marshall Plan as a direct threat to the buffer zone he has so carefully constructed. If Poland or Czechoslovakia were to tie their economies to the West, they would inevitably drift out of his political orbit. The choice becomes clear in his mind. He would rather rebuild slowly with his own resources than accept a single dollar that comes with American strings attached. The order comes from the Kremlin to Paris. Molotov, who had perhaps been genuinely exploring the possibility, abruptly changes his tone. He denounces the plan as an instrument of American imperialism, an attempt to create a Western military bloc. He packs his bags and walks out of the conference, slamming the door on any hope of continent-wide cooperation. The rejection is not just for the USSR. The message goes out to the satellite states as well. The government of Czechoslovakia, which had unanimously voted to accept the Marshall Plan, is summoned to Moscow. After a grueling meeting with Stalin, the Czech leaders are forced to publicly reverse their decision. It is a moment of profound national humiliation, a clear demonstration of who is really in charge. In response, Moscow announces its own version, the Molotov Plan, a series of bilateral trade agreements that will soon formalize into Comecon, the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance. This cements the economic division of the continent. The Iron Curtain is no longer just a political and military line. It is now an economic wall. Two Europes will now exist, one fueled by American dollars and rebuilding on a capitalist model, the other bound to Moscow, rebuilding on a socialist one. The economic wall is now firmly in place, dividing the continent. You turn your focus back to the epicenter of this growing conflict, the divided city of Berlin, floating like a tiny, fragile raft in the vast Red Sea of the Soviet occupation zone. Life in the western sectors of Berlin, controlled by America, Britain, and France, is becoming increasingly distinct from life in the Soviet sector. But they all share a common, debilitating problem. The currency. The old German currency, the Reichsmark, is practically worthless. It has been destroyed by hyperinflation, its value eroded to nothing. The economy of the city, and indeed all of Germany, runs not on money, but on barter and the black market. Cigarettes, coffee, and chocolate have become the real currency. A single pack of American cigarettes could buy you a week's worth of food, making them more valuable than any official banknote. This economic chaos is a breeding ground for instability and despair, undermining the entire project of rebuilding Germany. The Western Allies realize they must act if they want to revive the German economy and make their zones self-sufficient. They need a stable, trustworthy currency. After months of secret planning, they decide to introduce a new one. You can almost feel the clandestine nature of the operation. The new banknotes are designed in the United States, printed in secret by the U.S. Bureau of Engraving and Printing, given the codenames Bird Dog and Book G, and shipped to Germany in sealed crates disguised as diplomatic mail. On June 20, 1948, the Western powers make their move. They announce the creation of the Deutschmark, the new currency for the three Western occupation zones of Germany. Every citizen is allowed to exchange 60 of the old, worthless Reichsmarks for 40 of the new, valuable Deutschmarks. It is a bold stroke of economic surgery, designed to cut out the cancer of inflation and jumpstart the economy. The effect in the Western zones is immediate and almost magical. It's as if a switch has been flipped. Overnight, shop windows that had been empty for years are suddenly filled with goods. The black market vanishes. The new, stable currency coaxes hoarded items out of hiding, and a real economy begins to stir. But what is an economic miracle in the West is viewed as a declaration of war in the East. You now see this action from Stalin's perspective. The Western powers have acted unilaterally, without his consent, creating a separate economic state in their half of Germany. This new, powerful currency is now circulating in West Berlin, a city deep inside his territory. He sees this not as a technical financial reform, but as a deliberate political act to split Germany permanently and to create a prosperous, capitalist beacon in the heart of his communist sphere. The Deutschmark becomes a powerful magnet, its stability and value threatening to destabilize the weaker economy of the Soviet zone. Stalin sees it as a direct challenge to his authority, an act of economic aggression that he cannot allow to stand. The obscure technical subject of currency reform has now become the final trigger, the specific provocation that will turn the Cold War of words and policies into a direct, physical confrontation. The stage is set for a dramatic response. The lines have been drawn politically by the Truman Doctrine, economically by the Marshall Plan, and now, with the crisp new banknotes of the Deutsche Mark, a final fateful line has been drawn in the financial heart of Germany. The time for maneuvering and subtle pressure is over. Stalin decides he must force the Western powers out of Berlin once and for all. The spark has been struck, and the tinderbox of the divided city is about to ignite. The new Deutschmark is circulating in West Berlin, a symbol of defiance and a beacon of Western prosperity. For Stalin, this is the last straw. The time for subtlety is over. He decides to play his trump card, the geographic vulnerability of West Berlin itself. You are there in the final days of June 1948, and you can feel the tension tightening like a knot. The response begins not with a dramatic declaration of war, but with a series of seemingly bureaucratic obstructions that quickly escalate. On June 24th, just 4 days after the currency reform, the trap is sprung. You watch as Soviet military patrols suddenly appear at checkpoints on the roads and railways that connect West Germany to West Berlin. They halt a train, citing technical difficulties on the line ahead. Another roadblock goes up on the Autobahn, with guards politely but firmly turning back all trucks. Soon, the canals are also closed to barge traffic. The web is drawn shut with stunning speed and efficiency. All land and water access between the western zones of Germany and the western sectors of Berlin is severed. The city is sealed off. Over 2 million people in West Berlin, along with the small garrisons of American, British, and French troops stationed there, are now completely isolated, cut off from the outside world. They are an island, and the Soviets control the entire sea around them. The official Soviet explanation is a masterpiece of bureaucratic fiction. They claim the closures are due to urgent repairs needed on the bridges and railways, a technical issue that has nothing to do with politics. But everyone knows the truth. This is a siege. It is a bold, aggressive power play designed to starve West Berlin into submission. You can feel the strategic logic from Stalin's point of view. It seems like a foolproof plan. The Western Allies have only a few weeks of food and fuel reserves in their sectors. He believes they have only 2 choices, both of which are humiliating. They can either abandon Berlin, a catastrophic blow to American prestige and a signal to the world that they cannot protect their allies, or they can try to force their way through the blockade with an armed convoy. This would require them to fire the first shot, making them the aggressors and risking the outbreak of World War III, a war that no one in the West, with their armies largely demobilized, wants to fight. He has them in a checkmate, or so he thinks. In the streets of West Berlin, a wave of fear and uncertainty ripples through the population. They have just begun to recover from one war, and now they find themselves on the front line of a new one. The memories of siege and starvation from the final, desperate battle for Berlin in 1945 are still terrifyingly fresh. You can see the lights dimming in the city as electricity, supplied primarily from the Soviet sector, is cut off. The larders are already beginning to look bare. The blockade is not just a military maneuver, it's a psychological weapon. It's designed to sow panic, to make the Berliners themselves pressure the Western powers to give in and leave. Historians often point to this moment as the first great confrontation of the Cold War. The chess game of ideologies and economies has now escalated into a physical standoff over the fate of a city. The quiet, creeping tension has erupted into a clear, unambiguous crisis. The shadow war is no longer in the shadows. It is now a matter of life and death for 2 million people trapped behind a new, invisible wall of Soviet steel. You are now thousands of miles away from the darkening streets of Berlin. In the oppressive heat and humidity of a Washington, D.C. summer, the news of the full blockade has crackled across the transatlantic cables, and the atmosphere in the White House and the Pentagon is thick with controlled panic. The clatter of teletype machines provides a constant, nervous soundtrack. You can smell the stale coffee and cigarette smoke in the air as men in shirt sleeves, their faces slick with sweat, huddle over maps of Germany. the small, isolated circle of West Berlin looking like a target. The impossible has happened, and now President Truman and his advisors are staring at an impossible choice. Stalin's gambit has put them in a political cage with only two visible doors, and both lead to disaster. The first door is labeled abandonment. It is the easiest path, the one of least immediate resistance. They could simply withdraw their garrisons, concede that Berlin is geographically untenable, and leave the city to the Soviets. Diplomats could frame it as a strategic retreat, a necessary step to avoid war. But you can feel the immense weight of what that would mean. The United States has just declared to the world, through the Truman Doctrine, that it will support free peoples resisting subjugation. Berlin is the first, most visible test of that promise. To abandon the city would be to tell the world that America's word is hollow. The confidence of all of Western Europe, from Paris to Rome, would shatter. Why would they trust American protection if the US abandoned 2 million Berliners at the first sign of trouble? It would be a catastrophic moral and strategic defeat, a signal of weakness that would invite Soviet aggression elsewhere. This door is locked by the principle of credibility. The second door is labeled war. This is the choice many of Truman's military advisors are grimly, and in some cases eagerly, advocating for. The plan is straightforward. Assemble a large armored convoy at the border of the Soviet zone and drive it down the Autobahn to Berlin. If the Soviets try to stop it, the convoy will shoot its way through. General Lucius D. Clay, the American military governor in Germany, is a fierce proponent of this option, believing the Soviets are bluffing and will back down when faced with real force. But as you look into the faces of the men in Washington, you see the terrifying gamble this represents. What if the Soviets don't back down? What if they shoot back? A single shot fired on that highway could be the spark that ignites a third world war. A conflict between two superpowers fought over the ruins of the last one. And this time, America possesses a new and terrifying weapon, the atomic bomb. The thought of where that could lead is too dark to contemplate. This door is locked by the fear of annihilation. Historians still debate the intense arguments that took place in those frantic days. Was Truman ever seriously considering the military option, or was it just a bluff to keep his options open? He is trapped between the humiliation of retreat and the apocalypse of war. It is a global game of chicken, and the fate of the world hangs on who swerves first. For days, the meetings go on, the arguments circling endlessly. Abandonment is unacceptable. War is unthinkable. They are trapped. But then, as the crisis deepens, a third idea begins to be whispered in the corridors. An idea so audacious, so logistically daunting, that it initially sounds like a fantasy. It doesn't involve breaking the blockade on the ground. It involves flying over it. The choice might not be between the road and retreat, but between the road and the sky. The idea of supplying a city by air hangs in the tense atmosphere of Washington like an absurdity. It's one thing to fly in a few officials or some emergency medical supplies. It's another thing entirely to sustain a metropolis of over 2 million people. They need everything: food, medicine, coal for electricity, raw materials for industry. The daily tonnage required is staggering, thousands upon thousands of tons. The conventional military wisdom says it is impossible. No air force in history has ever attempted, let alone achieved, a logistical feat of this magnitude. It's like trying to fill a swimming pool with an eyedropper. Yet, the idea persists, born of desperation, and it has a powerful champion on the ground in Germany. You now focus on the figure of General Lucius D. Clay, the American military governor. Clay is a formidable man, an engineer by training, with a stern, unyielding demeanor and an absolute belief in American capability. He is the man on the spot, the de facto ruler of the American zone. Initially, as you know, he was the loudest voice advocating for an armed convoy to punch through the blockade. He saw the Soviet action as a test of will, a bluff that must be called with force. He famously cabled Washington, "When Berlin falls, West Germany will be next." But President Truman, wary of giving his generals the power to start World War III, has vetoed the convoy. So Clay, a man of action, is forced to consider other options. The idea of an airlift is presented to him, and while he is skeptical of its long-term viability, he sees it as a temporary solution, a way to buy time and show American resolve without firing a shot. The true believer, the man who turns the desperate idea into a concrete plan, is a British Air Commodore named Rex Waite. He sits down and does the math. He calculates the caloric needs of the Berlin population, the amount of coal required to keep a few power stations running, the total tonnage needed per day. The numbers are daunting. But then he looks at the available aircraft, mostly the reliable but relatively small C-47 Skytrains, the workhorses of World War II, known to pilots as the Goonie Bird. He calculates how many sorties, or round trips, would be needed. His conclusion is startling. It is, he argues, theoretically possible. It would be incredibly difficult, a logistical nightmare requiring unprecedented coordination and precision, but it is not impossible. You can picture Clay, a man accustomed to building dams and highways, looking at these calculations. The sheer audacity of the proposal appeals to his engineering mind. It is a grand, almost elegant solution to an impossible problem. It sidesteps the direct military confrontation on the ground. The Soviets had guaranteed air access to Berlin in a written agreement, a loophole they had overlooked when closing the land routes. Flying over the blockade would be using the one pathway they couldn't legally or easily close without firing the first shot, thereby becoming the aggressors. It turns Stalin's trap on its head. The decision is made. Clay gives the order to launch a full-scale airlift. He doesn't know if it will work. He doesn't know if they can sustain it for more than a few weeks, but it is a gamble he is willing to take. He famously tells a reporter, "The Soviets can't stop us without declaring war." He is betting the fate of a city on the ingenuity of his pilots, the reliability of their planes, and the vast industrial might of the United States. The audacious gamble is on. The mission has a name, Operation Victuals. The British will call their parallel effort Operation Plainfare. The world would come to know it as the Berlin Airlift. The order has been given, and now you witness the frantic, almost chaotic birth of the greatest air logistics operation in history. Operation Victuals begins not with a roar, but with a scramble. The initial force is laughably small for the task at hand. There are only about 100 of the aging C-47 Skytrains available in the American zone. These are the same planes that dropped paratroopers over Normandy, solid and reliable, but they can only carry about 3.5 tons of cargo each. It's a tiny fraction of what's needed. The first flight takes off on June 26, 1948, just 2 days after the blockade began. You can imagine the pilot wrestling with the controls of his Goonie Bird, its belly filled with powdered milk and flour, taking off into the uncertain skies. He flies along one of the 3 narrow, 20-mile-wide air corridors that have been guaranteed by the Soviets. The early days are a study in improvisation and controlled chaos. You see pilots flying missions with little sleep, navigating with basic instruments and road maps. The airfields in West Berlin, particularly Tempelhof, in the American sector, are relics of a pre-war era, their runways too short and their facilities inadequate for this kind of traffic. The logistics on the ground are a nightmare. Crews of German volunteers work alongside American soldiers, unloading the precious cargo by hand, their movements urgent and desperate. The weather is terrible. The skies over northern Germany notoriously foggy and unpredictable. Planes land and take off in conditions that would normally ground all air traffic. There are accidents, mechanical failures, and a constant, grinding exhaustion. From the Soviet side, you see a campaign of harassment designed to intimidate the pilots and disrupt the flights. Soviet fighter jets would buzz the lumbering transport planes, flying dangerously close, sometimes making mock attack runs. They release barrage balloons into the air corridors, and powerful searchlights are used at night to try and blind the Allied pilots as they make their landings. But they never fire a shot. Firing on an unarmed transport plane would be an unambiguous act of war, the one line Stalin is unwilling to cross. He is still convinced the airlift is a temporary, grandstanding gesture. He believes it will fail on its own, collapsing under the weight of its own impossibility as winter approaches. But back in the United States, the full might of the American military-industrial complex is beginning to stir. The airlift becomes a point of national pride. A new man is brought in to take command of the operation. The formidable Lieutenant General William H. Tunner. He is known as Tonnage Tunner, a logistical genius who had masterminded the seemingly impossible task of flying supplies over the Himalayas, the hump, to supply China during World War II. Tunner arrives in Germany and is appalled by the disorganization. He sees pilots lingering for coffee after landing, inefficient unloading procedures, and a lack of standardized maintenance. He immediately begins to institute a new, ruthless system of efficiency. He turns the airlift into a vast, unthinking conveyor belt. Everything is timed to the second. Pilots are forbidden from leaving their planes. Mobile snack bars on wheels are driven out to them so they can eat while their aircraft is being unloaded and refueled. Maintenance, loading, and flight times are standardized with unforgiving precision. The chaotic scramble is being transformed into a finely tuned, round-the-clock machine. The real workhorse of the airlift, the larger four-engine C-54 Skymaster, begins to arrive in greater numbers, each capable of carrying 10 tons, nearly triple the load of the old C-47s. The impossible is starting to look merely improbable. While the logisticians and pilots are focused on the mechanics of the airlift, you turn your attention to the people at the heart of the crisis, the 2 million citizens of West Berlin. For them, this is not a geopolitical chess match. It is a daily struggle for survival. You are walking through the streets of the besieged city, and you see a population that is weary but defiant. The blockade has plunged their lives into a state of profound uncertainty. The electricity, largely controlled by the Soviets, is only on for a few hours a day. At night, the city is a dark sea, punctuated by the faint flicker of candles in apartment windows. Hot water is a forgotten luxury. The subway runs on a limited, unpredictable schedule. Food becomes the central obsession of daily life. The airlift brings in the essentials, but it is a diet of grim necessity. The primary foods are dehydrated potatoes, powdered milk, and canned meat. Fresh fruit and vegetables are almost non-existent. Everything is strictly rationed. You can see the long, patient lines of Berliners queuing up with their ration cards, their faces etched with a mixture of anxiety and gratitude. The daily calorie count is kept just above the level needed to prevent mass starvation, but hunger is a constant, gnawing companion. Yet, amidst this hardship, something remarkable is happening. You can feel a profound psychological shift taking place. Just a few years ago, these American and British pilots were the enemy, the men who had dropped bombs on their city, reducing it to rubble. Now, they are saviors. The sound of the approaching aeroplanes becomes the city's soundtrack, its heartbeat. At first, the constant droning roar of engines day and night is a nuisance, a reminder of their confinement. But soon, it transforms into the most reassuring sound in the world. It is the sound of hope, the sound of defiance, the sound of a promise being kept. The people of West Berlin begin to actively participate in their own rescue. When the airlift commanders realize they need a new, longer runway at the Tegel airfield in the French sector, thousands of Berliners, men and women, volunteer for the job. Working around the clock with shovels and wheelbarrows, they complete the massive construction project in just 90 days. A feat of engineering and willpower that stuns the Allied commanders. It is a powerful symbol of their partnership. They are not passive victims waiting to be saved. They are active participants in the fight for their city's freedom. You see this bond solidifying every day. The Berliners' own democratically elected mayor, Ernst Reuter, becomes a powerful voice of defiance. A former communist who had broken with the party, he rallies his people with passionate speeches, urging them to stand firm and trust the Western allies. He tells a massive crowd, "You peoples of the world, You peoples of America, of England, of France, look upon this city, and recognize that this city, this people, must not be abandoned. The Berliners, who had so recently been the subjects of a totalitarian regime, now find themselves as the front-line defenders of democracy. Their resilience becomes a powerful weapon, confounding Stalin's strategy. He expected them to panic and capitulate. Instead, they endure, their spirit forged in hardship, their loyalty shifting decisively to the very nations that had conquered them. In the midst of this vast, impersonal operation of tonnage and timetables, a single, small act of kindness is about to change the entire emotional landscape of the airlift. You focus on a young American pilot, First Lieutenant Gale Halvorsen. He's a typical, good-natured farm boy from Utah, flying his C-5 for Skymaster in and out of Berlin, a tiny cog in General Tonner's massive machine. One day in July, he has a little extra time after landing his plane at Tempelhof. He walks over to the airport fence, where a group of about 30 German children are gathered, watching the planes with a quiet fascination that is common across the city. They don't beg, they don't ask for anything, they just watch, their faces pressed against the wire. Halvorsen is moved by their quiet dignity. He reaches into his pockets to see if he has anything to give them, but all he finds are 2 sticks of Wrigley's double mint gum. He breaks them in half and passes the 4 small pieces through the fence. The children who get a piece don't tear it open greedily. Instead, they carefully divide the tiny slivers among themselves, and those who don't get a piece are content just to sniff the sweet-smelling wrapper. A powerful realization hits Halvorsen. For these children, who have known nothing but war, rationing, and ruin, a simple piece of gum is a treasure, a forgotten taste of a normal childhood. He feels a sudden, impulsive urge to do more. He tells the children to come back the next day. He promises them that when he flies over the airfield on his approach, he will drop enough candy and chocolate for all of them. One of the children asks how they will know which plane is his among the hundreds. Halvorsen, thinking on his feet, says he will wiggle the wings of his plane as he comes in. He goes back to his base and tells his co-pilot and engineer what he has promised. They all agree to pool their candy rations for the next day's flight. The next day, as his C-54 approaches Tempelhof, he looks down and sees the small crowd of children waiting by the fence. True to his word, he rocks the wings of his massive plane back and forth, a gesture that earns him the nickname Uncle Wigglewings. His crew has fashioned small, makeshift parachutes from handkerchiefs and string, tying them to chocolate bars and packs of gum. They push the bundles out of the flare chute, and the tiny parachutes drift down to the ecstatic children below. This small, unauthorized act of kindness could have gotten him in serious trouble with the stern General Tonner. But word of what Uncle Wigglewings is doing spreads like wildfire. Soon, news stories about the Candy Bomber, or the Rosnen Bomber, Raisin Bomber, as the Germans called him, appear in the press. The public reaction is overwhelmingly positive. Instead of a reprimand, Halvorsen finds himself a hero. General Tonner, a master of public relations as well as logistics, recognizes a golden opportunity. He officially approves the candy drops, codenaming them Operation Little Victuals. Donations of candy and handkerchiefs start pouring in from all over America. School children hold collection drives, and candy companies donate entire crates. Soon, many of the airlift pilots are wiggling their wings and dropping candy to the children of Berlin. This simple human gesture transforms the perception of the airlift. It is no longer just a cold, military operation about delivering coal and potatoes. It is now a mission of profound humanity, a story of conquerors bringing not just sustenance, but joy to the children of their former enemy. It becomes the single most powerful symbol of the entire blockade, a weapon of kindness that Soviet propaganda simply cannot counter. While Operation Little Victuals is winning the hearts and minds of the Berliners, General Tonner's logistical machine is relentlessly evolving, turning the airlift from an emergency measure into a scientific marvel of efficiency. You are standing by the runways at Tempelhof or Gatto, and you are no longer witnessing a desperate scramble. but a perfectly choreographed ballet of men and machines. The sky itself has become a giant, invisible conveyor belt, operating with the precision of a factory assembly line. General Tunner's genius was to treat the air corridors not as open sky, but as fixed tracks. Each aircraft is assigned a specific altitude and a specific speed. Planes take off from their bases in West Germany at precise 3-minute intervals, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You watch as a C-5 for Skymaster, fully loaded, descends toward Berlin. The pilot doesn't have the luxury of circling if he misses his approach. There is another plane just 3 minutes behind him, and another 3 minutes behind that. The rule is absolute. If a pilot overshoots the runway or cannot land on his first attempt for any reason, he does not go round. He must fly his fully loaded plane all the way back to his home base in West Germany, a journey of several hours. This rule, though harsh, is essential to prevent a catastrophic pileup in the crowded air corridors. The pressure on the pilots is immense, requiring incredible concentration and skill, especially in the thick fog and icy conditions of the German winter. The air traffic controllers, using the new technology of ground-controlled radar approach, become the unseen heroes, talking the pilots down through zero visibility weather with calm, steady voices. On the ground, the efficiency is just as ruthless. As soon as the plane's wheels touch the runway, it is met by a swarm of activity. A jeep with a "Follow Me" sign guides it to its designated unloading spot. A team of German workers, their movements honed by endless repetition, descends on the cargo bay. They can unload 10 tons of coal or flour in a matter of minutes. At the same time, another team checks the engines, refuels the plane, and a mobile snack bar pulls up to the cockpit to give the flight crew a quick meal. The entire turnaround process, from landing to takeoff, is often accomplished in under 30 minutes. The planes are never even shut down. This relentless rhythm allows the airlift to achieve staggering numbers. By the spring of 1949, the conveyor belt is humming. On a single day in April, known as the Easter Parade, the airlift delivers nearly 13,000 tons of supplies in a 24-hour period, with one plane landing in Berlin every 62 seconds. This single day's tonnage is more than what was thought possible for an entire week at the start of the operation. They are not just meeting the city's minimum survival needs anymore. They are now flying in enough supplies to build up a surplus, to create a stockpile. You realize that the airlift is no longer just a temporary measure. It has become a sustainable, permanent solution. The impossible has been achieved through sheer, unglamorous, relentless organization. It is a testament to what can be accomplished when human ingenuity is focused on a single, clear objective. The sky over Berlin is no longer just a pathway. It is a lifeline, a constantly flowing river of hope, powered by thousands of tons of steel, fuel, and human determination. Now you shift your perspective once more, back to the Kremlin in Moscow. You look at the situation through the eyes of Joseph Stalin. For months, he has been watching the airlift with a mixture of disbelief and grudging respect. His initial assessment, shared by many military experts in the West, was that the airlift was a temporary, desperate stunt. He believed it was a face-saving gesture that would inevitably fail. He thought the laws of physics, logistics, and winter weather were on his side. He expected the Western powers to come to the negotiating table by autumn, ready to abandon Berlin in exchange for a lifting of the blockade. He just had to wait. But as the months drag on, the reports from his agents in Berlin paint a picture of infuriating success. The tonnage numbers keep climbing. The Berliners are not panicking, they are defiant. The candy bombers are turning the children of his sector against him with chocolate bars. The entire operation has become a daily, roaring symbol of American power and ingenuity, broadcast to the entire world. What was intended to be a demonstration of Soviet strength and Western weakness has backfired spectacularly. The airlift has turned into a massive, Pont-Cliff ongoing public relations disaster for the Soviet Union. Every plane that lands safely in Tempelhof is a victory for the West and a defeat for him. The blockade, his trump card, has become his cage. You see him analyzing the situation with his cold, strategic mind. He has profoundly underestimated two things. First, he underestimated the political will of President Truman and the Western Allies. He did not believe they would commit to such an expensive and risky operation for the sake of a symbolic city. He mistook their post-war desire for peace as a sign of weakness. Second, and perhaps more importantly, he underestimated the productive and logistical power of the American economy and military. He could not conceive of a system that could create and sustain such a massive air bridge out of thin air. It was a feat of organization that the centralized, top-down Soviet system, for all its might, simply could not match. The free market ingenuity he so despised had produced a logistical miracle. The blockade has also achieved the exact opposite of its strategic goal. Instead of pushing the Western powers apart, it has bound them together more tightly than ever before. The shared sense of crisis and purpose has accelerated talks for a formal military alliance. In April of 1949, as the airlift is reaching its peak performance, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, is formed. It is a collective security pact, built around the core principle that an attack on one member is an attack on all. This is Stalin's worst nightmare, a unified, permanent American-led military alliance stationed on his doorstep. The blockade, designed to push America out of Europe, has instead cemented its presence there for decades to come. The propaganda defeat is total. The Soviets look like bullies, trying to starve 2 million people, while the Americans look like heroic saviors. Stalin is a pragmatist. He knows when a strategy has failed. The blockade is no longer exerting pressure on the West. It is simply costing him political capital and making him look foolish. The checkmate has been broken. It is time to fold his hand. The signs of the end come not through a grand announcement, but through quiet, back-channel diplomatic whispers. The Soviets, careful to avoid any public admission of defeat, begin to send out signals that they are ready to talk. The relentless success of the Easter Parade and the formation of NATO have made it clear that the West will not back down. The blockade is now a losing proposition for Stalin, a constant drain on his international prestige with no hope of success. You can picture the secret meetings between American and Soviet diplomats at the United Nations in New York, hashing out the details of a face-saving retreat for the USSR. The deal is struck. The Soviets will lift the blockade of Berlin. In return, the Western powers will agree to a meeting of the foreign ministers to discuss the entire German question once again. It is a small concession, a diplomatic fig leaf that allows the Soviets to claim they achieved their goal of forcing a new round of negotiations. At 1 minute past midnight on May 12, 1949, after 324 days of siege, the barriers go up. You are there at a checkpoint on the Autobahn leading into Berlin. A Soviet soldier, his face impassive, raises the striped barrier pole. A moment later, the first truck of a British convoy rumbles through, its headlights cutting through the darkness, followed by an American convoy. The blockade is over. In West Berlin, the news is met with an outpouring of joyful, exhausted relief. People pour into the streets, cheering and celebrating. The lights come back on as the power is restored. The long, dark, hungry winter is finally over. The city has endured, and it has won. The airlift, however, does not stop immediately. The Western powers, wisely not trusting a simple promise, continue to fly in supplies for several more weeks, building up a massive stockpile in case the blockade is reimposed. They will not be caught unprepared again. But this victory, as profound as it is, comes with a heavy and permanent price. The crisis has shattered any lingering illusion that the four-power administration of Germany could ever work. The deep, unbridgeable chasm between the two sides is now exposed for all to see. The blockade has accelerated the formal division of the nation. Just 11 days after the blockade is lifted, on May 23, 1949, the three Western occupation zones are officially merged to create a new country, the Federal Republic of Germany, or West Germany, with its capital in the quiet university town of Bonn. The Soviets respond in October. transforming their occupation zone into the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany. The temporary lines drawn on a map by the victors in 1945 have now hardened into an international border, a fortified frontier between two opposing worlds. The city of Berlin remains an anomaly, a divided city within a divided nation, a tiny outpost of Western democracy trapped behind the newly solidified Iron Curtain. The Berlin blockade and the subsequent airlift was a clear victory for the West. They had stood their ground, kept their promise, and won a major propaganda battle without firing a shot. But it was a victory that cemented the very division it was fought over. The lines were no longer just on a map. They were now political realities, to German states, to opposing ideologies, to military blocs staring at each other across a fortified line. The wound in the heart of Europe was now a permanent, institutionalized scar. You stand now in the wake of this first great battle, looking back at the incredible arc of events. It all began in the silence and rubble of a world exhausted by war, with a fragile alliance between two powers who had nothing in common but a shared enemy. You watched as that alliance of convenience curdled into suspicion, as the ideological chasm between them grew too wide to bridge. You saw the architects of this new world, Truman, Stalin, and Churchill, driven by their own unique fears and ambitions, drawing lines across the map of Europe. An iron curtain fell, a metaphor given a name, dividing a continent and a world. You saw how this division was not just political, but economic and moral, with the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan drawing a clear line between two competing ways of life. Then, you saw the conflict find its focal point in the impossible geography of Berlin. A dispute over a new currency became the spark that ignited a full-blown confrontation. The Berlin blockade was a raw and brutal exercise of power, a siege designed to starve a city into submission. It was Stalin's checkmate, a move he believed was unbeatable. And yet, you witnessed the astonishing response. An idea born of desperation, the airlift blossomed into a logistical miracle. It was a triumph not of weapons, but of ingenuity, organization, and sheer, stubborn will. You saw the immense, humming conveyor belt in the sky, a testament to industrial might and human coordination. You felt the resilience of the Berliners themselves, their spirit unbroken, their loyalty won not by force, but by airdropped flour and chocolate bars. The story of the Berlin airlift is more than just a historical event. It is a profound lesson in the nature of power. It demonstrated that a conflict between great nations could be fought and won in a new way. The most powerful weapons in this battle were not bombs or tanks, but sacks of coal, powdered milk, and Hershey bars. The heroes were not just soldiers, but pilots, mechanics, air traffic controllers, and the ordinary, defiant citizens of a besieged city. It was a victory that affirmed the core principles the West claimed to stand for: liberty, partnership, and hope. It proved that a promise made to a vulnerable ally, no matter how strategically inconvenient, would be kept. The successful airlift sent a clear message to Moscow and to the rest of the world that the United States had the capacity and the resolve to contain the spread of Soviet influence. But as the cheers in Berlin fade, a new, colder reality sets in. The victory has come at the cost of solidifying the very division that caused the crisis. The temporary administrative zones have become two separate German nations. The Iron Curtain is no longer just a phrase, it is a fortified border. This first battle, this victory of food and hope, has defined the rules of engagement for a new, long, and twilight struggle. It has set the board for the decades of conflict to come. With the roar of airplanes over Berlin, the first battle of this new kind of war was won not with bullets, but with food and hope. It saved a city, but it also drew a permanent line across the globe. The Shadow War had begun. And so, the first chapter closes. The roar of the C-54 engines fades into a gentle hum, a distant memory on the horizon of time. You can let the tension of the blockade and the frantic energy of the airlift begin to dissolve, like sugar in warm tea. Feel the weight of those historical decisions, the immense pressure on the shoulders of leaders and pilots, slowly lifting, replaced by a sense of quiet accomplishment. The world held its breath, and then it exhaled. The crisis passed. The city was saved. Allow your own breath to deepen, to find a slow and steady rhythm, letting go of the day's concerns. Picture the city of Berlin, not in its moment of crisis, but in a moment of profound peace, long after the drama has ended. Imagine the quiet parks, the gentle rustle of leaves in the trees that were once planted by the rubble women. The sky above is clear and calm, no longer a conveyor belt of defiance, but a simple, peaceful blue canopy. The children of the airlift are now grandparents, their memories of Uncle Wigglewings a sweet and distant story they tell. There is no urgency now, no need to watch or worry. There is only stillness and the soft, reassuring feeling of a story that has found its end. You are safe, you are comfortable, and you can allow yourself to drift, carried on the gentle currents of your own breath, toward a place of deep and restful slumber. Let the echoes of history become a soft lullaby, a reminder of the strength and resilience that lies within the human spirit, a quiet promise that even after the greatest of storms, there is always the gentle peace of the morning that follows. The end. Sweet dreams.